Okay, so, the project. How can people believe in it? Isn't this just crazy, schizo nonsense? Well, I am certain that it is not, and if you are interested in these ideas but find them difficult to believe in, I'd like not to convert you or convince you, but simply take you through some of my own thought process in coming to believe these things with all of my being. For some migrants, belief comes quite naturally from innate feelings and echoing, but for me I was mostly guided along by a sort of trail of breadcrumbs, the more I looked into the matter. So, first and foremost, system iterations. It may be well known to you that Suki's explanation of our system resetting and playing out the same like a cutscene up until about 10,000 BC, so the Big Bang, the expansion of the universe, all of that plays out the same until about 10,000 BC. Well, as far as I know, it plays out mostly the same until about 10,000 BC. So that's not plucked out of thin air. It connects to a suggested theory of the development of the human mind called bicameral mind theory, where the internal voice that many have described, I would say it's the genesis of truly intelligent thought, began with the advent of the agricultural revolution. It is worth noting here that there isn't a single agreed upon explanation for why the agricultural revolution took place. It's not a universally agreed upon theory of the bicameral mind theory, but it has a lot to back it up, sourcing pre-agricultural myths' tendency to describe human actions more like reflexes, the theory being that the interference of the gods in daily life was the then separated hemispheres of the brain interpreting strange input. That is what we today describe as the internal voice. And this on its own is unconvincing, I admit. After all, I'd heard of this theory before coming to the project, so it stands to reason that I too could use this knowledge in making similar claim to Suki. And if this was it, I'd agree. But all the same, let's continue. So, moving on to souls, we now have a more concrete idea of what sort of delineation between brain and soul there is. For one, the internal voice. Now, I can't say this for sure, this is conjecture, but it would certainly seem that an internal dialogue is only something soulful beings possess. Whether the internal dialogue emanates from the soul or not, I can't say. But let us move into the reasoning behind my belief in the existence of the soul. I won't make a scientific argument here. I think it's unreasonable to assume that we could measure souls using our current level of science, so instead we're going to start with philosophy. Immanuel Kant. Now, his belief in the soul derived from his religious beliefs, and furthermore he stated his opinion that the soul could not be deduced irrefutably by reason, though he did express his belief that in the future the existence of the soul would and could be proven. Nonetheless, we start with him to talk about lifer or life kaiji understanding of the soul as it stands. Particularly for my trail of breadcrumbs that I was following in the field of German idealism. So Kant draws from Descartes' breakthrough that the only irreducible fact we can know for certain is I think, therefore I am. In other words, reality is not the one and the same as our perception of it. This is monumentally important as it demonstrates something that leads us quite strongly in favour of belief in the soul, which is that the true nature of things lies outside our perception, i.e. reality. This is different, note, from nihilism, because nihilism, existential nihilism would say we have no reason to believe anything exists, whereas German idealism, particularly Kant, it takes that more to mean that there is a world beyond our perception and understanding, rather than there being nothing. And this isn't a new idea. It can be traced all the way back to Platonic forms, or Pythagoras' realm of the spheres. Nonetheless, it helps to clarify these matters in a more modern frame of understanding. I could compare Pythagoras' realm of the spheres to system space. I mean, he talked about the world being governed by rules which emanated from a heavenly realm, which certainly I can make a comparison there, but I don't think that's an advanced enough point of view. I mean, it's also tied into weird ideas about numerology and about contemporary religious beliefs, so I think it's... So yeah, I am sticking with German idealism here. That is, we can determine the essential qualities of that which exists outside our perceptive reality. Firstly, our reality is material. Therefore, at least to us, to our realm of perception, that which lies outside of it is immaterial. Secondly, our reality is governed by time. So we know that things which lay outside of our reality are, at least to us, immortal. This is simple, yes, but there seems to be a misconception of his assignment of these qualities to the soul is simply to defy investigation. Oh, it's around forever and you can't see it. Well, no, it's because if you could see it and if it was mortal, you know, then it would be part of reality, wouldn't it? So you see, if a soul was not both of these things, it would not be a soul at all, it would be a brain. But there are two issues here. First, Suki said that souls sort of expire after about 1 million years. And secondly, time does exist within system space, that is to say that time exists beyond the reality of our specific system. And I think simply here we have to separate between our perception of time and the system's implementation of it. That is, I doubt that systems iterate time at the same rate that we perceive it. You know, and indeed our perception of time doesn't even always align with the way time seems to pass in reality either. You know, the age-old adage of time passes when you're having fun. You know, perception of time is not set in stone as such. And so the soul would then be expiring as according to an outer system of time. However, the eternity that I was describing does apply to most other elements outside of systems. So Aurora, for example, is not subject to system space but running through it. And to quickly cover Aurora, a simple-ish way to think of it, at least for me, is like a soul for the material. All energy and matter is reducible to smaller component parts, so in essence it derives from a singular source. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in this, but what differentiates particles is their behaviour, with their makeup being irreducible and therefore unidentifiable as anything other than a matter in and of itself. That is to say, you know, an electron and a quark are not actually made of different things as I understand it, but just behave differently. And subtle behaviours govern this matter, which then accumulate into bigger effects, as I understand it, from which things start to become separate implementations, at least to our perception, of an infinite source of all existence. This is basically, I would argue, what we can see of Aurora, kind of like the tip of the iceberg. And now to return to souls, I'd like to go into something which I feel is not very well understood. Humanity. This, I must emphasise, will just be my theory and my opinion on the matter. Arthur Schopenhauer, continuing the work of Kant, developed his theory of the world being will as representation. That is, the world reflected our own will to live, our base consciousness. The will to live is quite different from the urge to survive, though there is some relation. The will to live is essentially natural urge compounded by intelligence, its strongest effect being the desire to procreate, which, though animals have it too, becomes a lot more complex when you mix it with the human mind. So, what do we know about humanity? It is always present on some level, and it develops with greater disconnection, or perhaps more appropriately, lack of connection or less connection, from the soul and Aurora. So, am I just saying, it's your urges, bro, and leaving it at that? Certainly not. An urge would be to eat all of your food in one go. The will to live would be to ration it across the week. and I'm not saying don't ration your food across a week if you have a limited supply, but there's a deeper reason behind why you do that, and you might find that even if there was a reasonable reason not to do that, you might find it quite difficult not to have your will to live override it. That is to say, I think humanity is an overgrown, rational will to live, not merely survive, but to live. So to give another example unrelated to survival, urge would be to have sex constantly, but will to live adds in all the other factors that we know come with it, stuff like stuff like foreplay and fetishes. Humanity is an extension of urge, in essence. Again, in my opinion. And so what can we say about it? Well, presuming it is ever present in all systems, it is how amplified these effects are. They will never be non-present, so we can imagine a minimum level of humanity quite easily. I think understanding humanity as it is manifest in life, then, is as simple as this. How far from your imagined minimum is society as it exists currently? For me, at least, it is quite clear that it is dangerously far. That doesn't present any particular view of morality, I would argue, and even those who fight against the exercise of urge are themselves subject to just as strong an urge to control, taken to a logical conclusion. And even private practice of moderation are more often motivated by pride or even simplistic notions of things being inherently right or wrong. This leads to my favourite summarisation of humanity, which I have to confess I did come up with myself, which is, it is both sides in an argument. There isn't a rational stance you can take against it. To hate humanity will derive from it feeding ideas of revenge, or justice, or rightfulness, and even hate itself is, I think, derives more from a will to live than from deeper, more meaningful feelings. and then to love humanity leads to hedonism, avarice, greed, if you try to then escape from the idea of hating it. And indeed trying to end all of those things by whatever means is itself, will lead to terrible results. It's not a maze that you can escape from on its own terms. And in a sense, escape from it doesn't entirely make sense. Think instead of a prisoner in a cell, and his being transported to imagination to a fantasy world outside it. This is far from an exact analogy, but essentially you can only escape humanity in a way where you remain locked behind its bars. But of course, the objection comes that humanity does not make LFE a paradise or utopia. Genocides, war, death, murder, it all still happens outside of life. And indeed, humanity affects things above this level. But nonetheless, I think there is a link. Essentially, the effect humanity has on people necessarily would affect larger society, even with a relatively small impact on the individual. These things are cumulative, the same way culture can be. So I would contend that though humanity does not create murder and genocide itself, it is fair to say that a planet that was home to the 30 Years' War, Taiping Rebellion, the World Wars, English and American Civil Wars, the Holocaust, Holodomor, or Armenian genocide, and the tens of thousands have died in bombings and famines, and that barely scratches the surface of most likely no less than 1 billion each, is the exception rather than the rule. Which is not to say that these atrocities were carried out because somebody decided to be evil one day, with quite a few exceptions, of course, but not enough to break this rule, but primarily for political reasons, stemming ultimately from competition over resources. My argument here is essentially that what is affected is the weight of how much resources are valued over other lives. At what point do you kill a whole group of people just because it would be nice to have what they have? And at what point do you overcome the deeper desire to spare them and forego greater material gain. And that's essentially where I'd place humanity in terms of its effect on society. How far does it push you that way? Anyway, I have passed this script by Sanya, so hopefully it is fairly accurate, but if you notice any errors, please do point them out to me, and if there are any further questions, I'd love to hear them too. Thank you very much.